Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soothing, something gentle, something relaxing. A long, slow wander through the medieval medical world, where your doctor believed in astrology, your barber owned the sharpest knife in town, and your best shot at survival was probably just staying home and hoping for the best. So dim the lights, maybe get under a blanket, and let's softly drift into an era where medical professional meant guy with a bowl of leeches and a confident attitude. Now, medieval medicine wasn't stupid on purpose. That's important. These people were not cartoon villains, twirling mustaches, while prescribing powdered frog spleen. They were working with the best knowledge available at the time, which was mostly ancient Greek theory, religious belief, and a strong suspicion that your blood was just too enthusiastic. The foundation of European medieval medicine came from the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates. These ancient thinkers believed the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, it meant your humors were out of balance. Too much blood, you're feverish. Too much black bile, you're melancholic. Too much yellow bile, you're angry. Honestly, it sounds like an early personality test. And so, for centuries, physicians attempted to rebalance the humors. Not gently, not cautiously, but decisively. Because if you're going to fix someone's bile levels, you might as well commit. Let's begin with the undisputed champion of medieval overconfidence: bloodletting. Bloodletting was everywhere. It was used for fevers, headaches, plague, smallpox, nosebleeds, insomnia, acne, heartbreak, probably bad hair days. If you were alive, you had blood. And if you had blood, it could be removed. Physicians believed illness was caused by an excess of blood. So naturally, the cure was to drain some out, or a lot out. Or perhaps just keep draining until the patient stopped complaining. There were 2 main ways to do this. One was venesection, which involved slicing a vein and letting it flow into a bowl. The other was cupping, which used heated cups to draw blood to the surface of the skin. And then there were leeches. Leeches were the medieval spa treatment nobody asked for. These small, determined worms were placed on the skin, where they attached and politely dined on your bloodstream. Leeches were considered refined, elegant, controlled, which is a lovely way of saying we let worms bite you on purpose. Now, here's the problem. When you are already sick, perhaps with the plague, or pneumonia, or something mysterious and feverish, removing large amounts of blood does not strengthen you. It makes you weaker. It lowers blood pressure. It reduces oxygen flow. It makes fainting a distinct possibility. But medieval doctors were very confident, and confidence is half the cure. The other half, unfortunately, was usually fatal. Let's gently float over to the Black Death. When the plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, doctors responded with more bloodletting. Because if your humors are out of balance, surely the correct move during a catastrophic bacterial infection is to lose a pint or 2. In reality, plague victims were already dehydrated and in shock. Removing blood just accelerated the process. It was, in many cases, the difference between maybe and definitely not. But bloodletting was only the beginning. Next, we have purging. Medieval medicine believed the body needed to expel toxins. If you were ill, something bad was inside you. The solution: get it out immediately. This led to emetics, substances that caused vomiting, and laxatives that could, let's say, clear a castle hallway in record time. One popular purgative was hellebore, a plant that is mildly poisonous. In small doses, it caused vomiting and diarrhea. In slightly larger doses, it caused heart irregularities, seizures, and death. But it was all about balance. Just the right amount of toxic plant. What could go wrong? Another favorite was mercury. Yes, mercury used to treat everything from skin conditions to syphilis. Mercury was applied topically, swallowed, and even vaporized for inhalation. Because if you have a bacterial infection, what you really need is heavy metal poisoning. Patients undergoing mercury treatment often lost teeth, their gums deteriorated, they drooled uncontrollably, their kidneys slowly failed. But the syphilis sometimes improved temporarily, so that counted as a win. Let's drift gently towards surgery. Now, medieval surgery was surprisingly advanced in some ways. Surgeons could set bones, they could perform amputations, they could remove bladder stones, which is impressive when you consider that anesthesia was basically bite this cloth. There were no sterile environments, no germ theory. Instruments were reused, sometimes wiped, occasionally rinsed, rarely boiled. Infections were common, shock was common, death was statistically predictable. Trepanation was one of the more dramatic procedures. This involved drilling or scraping a hole into the skull to relieve pressure. It was used for head injuries, seizures, and sometimes just persistent headaches. Remarkably, some patients survived. Skulls have been found with healed trepanation holes, but survival rates were not exactly reassuring. And if surgery wasn't risky enough, there were also cures involving animals. For example, in some parts of medieval Europe, it was believed that placing a freshly killed chicken on a plague bubo could draw out the infection. The chicken would supposedly absorb the disease. This did not work. The chicken simply died. The patient usually did too. There were also ointments made from animal fat, herbs, and occasionally crushed insects. Because if you're going to make a medicinal paste, why not add beetles? Let's pause briefly with medieval dentistry. If you had a toothache, your options were limited. There was no root canal. There was no anesthetic. There was a man with pliers. Tooth extraction was swift, brutal, often done in public squares. The barber surgeon would grip the tooth and pull. If it broke, well, he would keep pulling. Infections were common, and since antibiotics were about 500 years away, a bad tooth could become a life-threatening abscess. Which brings us to perhaps the most tragic category, royal medicine. Because if you were a king or queen, you didn't escape bad medicine. You just received more elaborate versions of it. Take King Henry IV of England. He suffered from a mysterious skin condition and possibly epilepsy. His treatments included bloodletting and various herbal concoctions. Then there was King Charles II of Spain, a Habsburg, famously inbred, a man whose jaw entered rooms before he did. When Charles fell ill in 1700, his doctors attempted everything: bloodletting, emetics, enemas. They even placed the entrails of animals on his body to draw out evil spirits. Because sometimes medicine and exorcism had a scheduling overlap. Charles did not recover. But of course he didn't. He was already fragile, the genetic equivalent of a royal experiment gone wrong. Medieval and early modern medicine simply hurried things along. Let's softly move into childbirth. Childbirth in the medieval world was dangerous enough on its own. Infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labor. These were constant threats. But treatments could make things worse. Midwives sometimes used herbal stimulants to speed labor. Some worked. Some caused uterine rupture. Others were simply ineffective while everyone waited nervously. If a baby was breech or stuck, there were few options. Surgical intervention usually meant death for the mother. And if infection set in afterward, known as childbed fever, the cure might involve bloodletting. Again, it's almost comforting how consistent they were. Now, let's not pretend medieval medicine was entirely hopeless. Herbal knowledge was sometimes surprisingly effective. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. Honey was used on wounds and does have antibacterial properties. But these successes were often mixed with treatments that did the exact opposite of healing. And the key thing to remember, as we drift deeper into this long, soft historical night, is that medieval physicians truly believed they were helping. They studied at universities, they read classical texts, they wore robes, they spoke Latin. They were, by the standards of the time, experts. They just didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about viruses. They didn't know that draining half a person's blood during a fever might not be the most supportive move. So when we look back and gently smile at the idea of leeches and mercury tonics, we're not mocking them. Well, maybe just a little, but mostly we're witnessing the long human attempt to make sense of suffering. And sometimes that attempt involved worms. Now we glide gently into the medieval apothecary, which was less like a pharmacy and more like a wizard's pantry with a business license. The apothecary was the place where medicine became creative. Shelves were stacked with jars of powdered roots, dried flowers, preserved lizards, mysterious resins, and occasionally something that looked like it had once had legs and opinions. The medieval worldview did not separate science, symbolism, and spiritual belief the way we do now. If something looked magical, rare, or expensive, it probably had healing power, because why wouldn't it? And this is how we arrive at the unicorn horn. Now, you may be thinking, unicorns aren't real, which is correct. But medieval Europe was not overly concerned with that detail. What was sold as unicorn horn was usually narwhal tusk. These long, spiraled ivory tusks were imported from northern waters and displayed in royal courts as proof that unicorns absolutely existed and were very cooperative about donating parts. Unicorn horn, often called alicorn, was believed to neutralize poison. Kings and queens were especially fond of this idea, because being royal in the medieval period meant that someone, somewhere, was probably considering poisoning you. Drinking vessels were carved from unicorn horn. Powdered unicorn horn was mixed into drinks. It was scraped into medicine, and the wealthy paid astonishing amounts for it. Did it cure poison? No. But it did make you feel proactive. And, in medieval medicine, that was half the experience. Let's float gently to bezoar stones. Bezoars are hardened masses found in the stomachs of goats and other animals. Essentially, compacted hair and plant fibers, which does not sound like something you want near your soup. But in medieval Europe, bezoars were prized as antidotes to poison. If you dropped a bezoar stone into a drink, it was believed to absorb toxins. Royal courts kept them in treasure cabinets. They were mounted in gold. They were treated with reverence. In reality, they did not neutralize poison, but they did look impressive. And sometimes, looking impressive is medically adjacent. Now, let's glide into something even more soothing. Powdered gemstones, yes. If you were wealthy enough, and ideally royal, your medicine might include crushed pearls, ground emeralds, or powdered sapphires. The theory was based partly on symbolism. Gems were pure, they were rare, they were beautiful. Therefore, they must contain healing properties. Pearls were used for heart problems and melancholy. Emeralds were believed to improve vision. Rubies were associated with vitality. And if you couldn't get better from your illness, at least you could sparkle internally. Of course, ingesting powdered minerals did not generally cure disease. It sometimes caused digestive irritation, but it did make you feel like you were receiving elite care. Which brings us, softly, to mummy powder. This one is particularly strange. In medieval and early modern Europe, ground-up mummified remains from Egypt were sold as medicine. The substance was called mummia. It was believed that mummies contained preserved life force, so naturally, consuming them would transfer that vitality to you. Mummia was used for everything from bruises to internal bleeding. It was sold by apothecaries across Europe. There was a brisk trade in Egyptian remains. Eventually, supply ran low, and counterfeit mummy powder became common, made from recently deceased individuals who were creatively preserved. It did not cure disease, but it did create a fascinating intersection between archaeology and pharmacy. Let's gently wander into the plague years again. During outbreaks of plague, apothecaries worked overtime. Remedies were in high demand. One popular preventative measure was the pomander, a small ball filled with aromatic substances like ambergris, musk, cloves, and rose petals. It was worn around the neck or carried in hand. The idea was that disease spread through bad air, miasma. If you could block or counteract the foul smells, you could protect yourself. So cities filled with the scent of perfume and panic. Doctors wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs, because if the air was toxic, surely smelling strongly of rosemary would fix it. Now, here's the quiet tragedy beneath the absurdity. The miasma theory wasn't entirely foolish. Disease can spread through airborne particles. They were just missing the microbial part of the explanation. And without microscopes, bacteria remained politely invisible. Let's drift toward something equally unsettling. Theriac was a complex medicinal compound that originated in ancient Greece and remained popular for centuries. It sometimes contained dozens of ingredients, herbs, spices, opium, and occasionally snake flesh. It was marketed as a universal antidote, a cure-all, headache, theriac, plague, theriac. Snake bite, definitely theriac. Preparation of theriac could be a public spectacle. Apothecaries mixed it ceremonially, emphasizing its complexity and authority. The presence of opium meant that patients often felt better, or at least pleasantly detached from their suffering, which is not nothing. But it did not eliminate infections. Still, it persisted for centuries. Because once a remedy becomes traditional, it is very hard to gently retire it. Now let's softly pivot to something more domestic. Household remedies. Not everyone had access to unicorn horn or powdered emerald. Most people relied on local herbs and folk knowledge. Garlic was widely used, and garlic does have antimicrobial properties, so occasionally they stumbled into something effective. Honey was applied to wounds, again surprisingly useful. But then there were charms and incantations. Written prayers were placed on the body. Amulets were worn for protection. Disease was not purely physical in the medieval imagination. It was spiritual, moral, cosmic. If you were sick, perhaps God was displeased. Perhaps demons were involved. Perhaps Saturn was in the wrong house. Astrology played a significant role in treatment decisions. Physicians consulted star charts before performing bloodletting, because obviously the moon had strong opinions about your spleen. There were diagrams showing which zodiac signs governed which body parts. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Pisces the feet. You wouldn't want to operate on someone's knee when Mars was in retrograde. That would be irresponsible. Now, as we drift deeper into the candlelit apothecary, let's talk about something that sounds harmless: bathing. Medieval Europeans did bathe. Contrary to popular myth, they were not permanently crusted in dirt. But during plague outbreaks, public bathhouses were sometimes closed. Warm water was thought to open the pores, allowing disease to enter. So people avoided bathing at the exact moment when cleanliness might have helped. Instead, they focused on scent, perfume, incense, sweet-smelling herbs. It was a fragrant form of damage control. And then there was urine diagnosis. Yes, physicians examined urine in glass flasks, assessing color, clarity, and sediment. This was called uroscopy. Charts were created showing what different shades meant. Pale yellow, good; dark red, concerning; cloudy, perhaps humoral imbalance. Urine was one of the few diagnostic tools available, and surprisingly, it sometimes provided useful clues, but interpretation was flexible. A skilled physician could look at a flask and confidently explain almost anything. Let's gently circle back to royalty, because they truly received the deluxe experience. Catherine de' Medici of France relied heavily on astrologers and herbalists. Nostradamus himself briefly served as a court physician, which sounds impressive until you remember that predicting the future was part of the job description. Royal children, especially, were subjected to elaborate remedies. If a prince developed a rash, consultations multiplied, exotic ingredients were ordered, astrological charts were drawn, and sometimes the treatments were worse than the rash. Yet, throughout all this, medieval medicine was evolving. Slowly, gradually, painfully, universities like Bologna and Paris trained physicians in anatomy. Though human dissection was rare and controversial, knowledge crept forward, errors accumulated, corrections were rare but meaningful, and through it all, patients endured. They trusted their healers. They swallowed the potions. They held still for the leeches, because what else could they do? When you are ill, hope is powerful, even if that hope arrives in the form of powdered goat stomach. Now, physicians, the university-trained, Latin-speaking, robe-wearing, intellectuals considered surgery beneath them. Surgery involved touching blood and bodily fluids, and physical effort, so the hands-on work fell to barber surgeons, men who shaved beards, trimmed hair, and, when necessary, removed limbs. The red and white barber pole we still see today. That's not decorative. The red symbolized blood. The white symbolized bandages. Branding was strong in the Middle Ages. Barber surgeons were practical. They learned through apprenticeship. They were not philosophers of the humors. They were technicians of the blade, and blades were very important. Now let's glide gently into the absence of anesthesia. There was no modern anesthesia, no gas, no forced sedation. There were herbs, mandrake root, opium, alcohol. Mandrake was believed to have sedative properties. It sometimes worked. It sometimes caused hallucinations. It occasionally caused death. Opium was more reliable, but dosage was a guessing game. Too little and the patient screamed. Too much and they stopped breathing. So often, patients were simply restrained. Assistants held them down. Family members might help. Cloth was placed in the mouth to bite. Speed became a surgeon's most valuable skill. The faster you cut, the better the reputation. Let's float over to amputations. Amputation was common in cases of severe injury, infection, or battlefield trauma. Without antibiotics, a badly infected limb could be fatal. The solution was straightforward. Remove the limb. The procedure involved cutting through skin and muscle, sawing through bone, and then cauterizing the wound with a heated iron to stop bleeding. Cauterization was intense. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, but it sealed blood vessels, and sometimes the patient survived. Remarkably, some did, but survival depended heavily on luck and immune system resilience, and whether the instruments had been used on someone else 10 minutes earlier, which they probably had. There was no germ theory. Surgeons did not understand bacteria. They did not sterilize instruments in the modern sense. Knives were wiped, maybe rinsed, rarely boiled. Infections were common. Pus was expected. In fact, some surgeons believed laudable pus was a sign of healing, which is not entirely comforting. Now let's gently move toward dentistry. Medieval dentistry. If you had a toothache, you had one real solution: extraction. Tooth decay was common. Diets were heavy in carbohydrates. Oral hygiene was limited. And when pain struck, it could be excruciating. Enter the tooth key. The tooth key looked vaguely like a door key. It had a claw at the end. The surgeon would attach the claw to the tooth, brace against the gum, and twist. Not pull, twist. Sometimes the tooth came out cleanly. Sometimes it shattered. Sometimes it took a piece of jawbone with it. But the pain stopped. Eventually, and if infection followed, well, we've already discussed bloodletting. Now let's float to something more delicate: bladder stones. Bladder stones were common, particularly among men. They were extremely painful. Imagine a small rock bouncing around in your internal plumbing. Surgical removal was possible. The procedure was called lithotomy. It involved making an incision near the perineum and extracting the stone manually. No anesthesia, no antiseptic, no antibiotics, just confidence. Lithotomy was so dangerous that some surgeons specialized exclusively in it. They traveled from town to town performing stone removals like a very niche touring act. Some patients survived, some did not. But when you are in constant agony, even risky surgery can seem appealing. Now, let's gently wander into battlefield medicine. Medieval warfare was brutal. Swords, arrows, crossbows, later, early firearms. Injuries were severe. Limbs were crushed. Flesh was torn. Surgeons followed armies. They worked quickly. Efficiency mattered more than elegance. Gunshot wounds, when firearms became more common, were especially problematic. Surgeons initially believed gunpowder was poisonous, so they poured boiling oil into wounds to neutralize the poison. Boiling oil, which, as you can imagine, did not improve morale. It was the French surgeon Ambroise Paré in the 16th century who questioned this practice. One day, he ran out of oil and improvised a gentler mixture of egg yolk, oil of roses, and turpentine. Patients treated with the gentler dressing survived at higher rates, which must have been a slightly awkward realization. Oh, so maybe we don't pour boiling oil into people. Progress is sometimes just the absence of scalding. Let's drift toward trepanation again, but a bit more intimately. Trepanation, drilling a hole into the skull, was used for head trauma. The belief was that pressure or evil spirits needed release. Surprisingly, archaeological evidence shows many patients survived the procedure. Bone grew back around the hole, but survival doesn't necessarily mean comfort. And the idea of someone carefully scraping your skull while you are awake is not exactly bedtime material. So we'll move on. Let's talk about hernias. Hernias were treated with trusses, tight belts designed to hold the protrusion in place. But if surgery was attempted, the risks were extreme: infection, hemorrhage, shock. Many surgeons simply refused to operate on certain conditions. They knew their limits, which is quietly reassuring. Now let's gently consider something subtle: pain itself. Pain in the medieval world was understood differently. It was not always seen as something to eliminate. It could be spiritual, purifying, a test of faith. Patients endured astonishing discomfort. Childbirth, surgery, chronic illness, all without modern analgesics. And yet, life expectancy, while lower than today, was not universally tragic. Many people lived into middle age or beyond, which suggests that not everyone ended up under a barber surgeon's saw. But when they did, survival was a delicate balance, and this brings us softly to hospital care. Medieval hospitals were often run by religious orders. They were places of charity, shelter, prayer. Medical treatment was basic. Comfort mattered. Spiritual care mattered. In some ways, hospitals were less about aggressive intervention and more about easing suffering, which, frankly, was sometimes the safer approach, because aggressive intervention could escalate quickly. Let's circle briefly back to royal patients. Kings and queens did not escape surgical risks. In fact, they were sometimes more vulnerable to experimental treatments. King Henry V of England survived an arrow wound to the face as a young man. The arrow penetrated his cheekbone. A surgeon named John Bradmore devised a specialized tool to remove the arrowhead, and remarkably, Henry survived. It was a rare success story. But for every successful extraction, there were countless procedures that ended quietly. No dramatic music, no heroic speeches, just a candle flickering in a stone room, and a surgeon wiping his blade. Let's begin with melancholy. Melancholy was not just sadness, it was a full humoral experience. According to the four-humor theory, too much black bile caused a person to become withdrawn, gloomy, anxious, and sometimes irrational. If you were quiet, thoughtful, or stared out windows for extended periods, someone might gently suggest your bile situation was getting ambitious. Treatment, naturally, rebalancing. Bloodletting was popular. Purgatives were common. Dietary adjustments were recommended. Patients were told to avoid overly dry foods, because dryness was linked to black bile, so no excess lentils for you. Music was sometimes prescribed. Fresh air, gentle companionship, which, surprisingly, is not terrible advice. But for severe cases, especially among nobles, things escalated. Let's float softly to England. King Henry VI, for example, experienced prolonged mental health crises in the 15th century. He became unresponsive for months at a time. He did not speak. He did not react to news. Even the birth of his son failed to stir him. Today, historians speculate about conditions like catatonia or severe depression. At the time, explanations were humoral, or spiritual, or both. There were no mood stabilizers. There was prayer and cautious observation, and, occasionally, discreet political maneuvering while the king stared into space. Royal mental illness was especially inconvenient. Now let's glide toward hysteria. Ah yes, hysteria. The word itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus, because of course it does. The theory was simple. If a woman experienced anxiety, fainting, mood swings, or opinions, her uterus might be wandering around her body, causing disruption. Yes, wandering. The wandering womb theory suggested that the uterus could float upward, pressing against organs and creating symptoms. The cure, persuade it to return home. Pleasant smells were placed near the lower body to lure the womb downward. Foul smells were held near the nose to repel it from rising. It was essentially aromatherapy for organ relocation. Marriage was also recommended, because naturally, the solution to unexplained symptoms was a husband. This diagnosis persisted for centuries. It was tidy, it was gendered, it was deeply confident, and entirely incorrect. But confidence, as we've seen, was a cornerstone of medieval medicine. Now let's drift into something more spiritual. Possession. When someone experienced seizures, hallucinations, or erratic behavior, demonic possession was often considered. Epilepsy, in particular, was sometimes called the falling sickness. Sudden collapse and convulsions did not scream neurological disorder to a medieval observer. They suggested something supernatural, Exorcism became a treatment. Priests were summoned. Prayers were recited. Holy water was applied generously. Now, here's where things get quietly complicated. Exorcism sometimes provided psychological comfort. Ritual can be powerful. Community support can stabilize someone. But it was not a cure for epilepsy, nor for schizophrenia, nor for severe mood disorders. Still, the Church played a central role in care. Monasteries sometimes housed individuals with mental illness. They were not always cruel environments. Sometimes they were places of shelter, though not always. Now, let's float gently toward something more fashionable: lovesickness. Lovesickness was considered a legitimate medical condition. Excess longing for a beloved could cause weight loss, insomnia, paleness, and sighing. Doctors might examine the patient's pulse while naming potential love interests. If the pulse quickened at a certain name, well, diagnosis confirmed. The cure was usually either union with the beloved or distraction, which is oddly modern advice. Let's wander toward insomnia. Sleep disturbances were blamed on humoral imbalance or spiritual unrest. Herbal remedies like valerian were used. Warm baths, light reading, ideally scripture, and sometimes, if a noble couldn't sleep, their physicians simply sat nearby to offer reassuring conversation, which sounds both comforting and slightly awkward. Now we must gently visit one of medieval Europe's more troubling responses to collective psychological stress: mass hysteria. There were outbreaks of dancing mania, groups of people dancing uncontrollably for days. There were episodes of uncontrollable laughter or convulsions spreading through communities. Modern historians speculate about stress, trauma, ergot poisoning, or social contagion. At the time, explanations varied. Demons, divine punishment, astrological events. Treatment involved prayer, pilgrimage, occasionally bloodletting, because of course. But mass psychological events reveal something deeply human. When societies endure famine, plague, war, stress accumulates, and sometimes it spills out rhythmically. Let's gently pivot to the concept of madness more broadly. Medieval language around mental illness was varied. Terms like lunacy were tied to the moon. It was believed that lunar cycles influenced behavior. The full moon was blamed for erratic actions, which, to be fair, still lingers in modern folklore. Asylums in the medieval period were rare and not standardized. Care was typically managed within families or religious institutions. Some individuals with severe mental illness were marginalized. Others were integrated into community life. There was no single approach, no uniform cruelty, no uniform compassion either. Now let's glide back to royalty, because royal breakdowns were never private. Charles VI of France experienced episodes of delusion in the late 14th century. He believed he was made of glass. Yes, he was terrified of shattering. He reportedly reinforced his clothing with iron rods to protect himself. Historians debate the diagnosis: psychosis, bipolar disorder, something else entirely. His court navigated these episodes carefully. Politics continued. Advisors whispered. Power shifted subtly. But imagine living in a palace where your king fears physical fragmentation. It adds a certain fragility to governance. Let's float toward physicians themselves. Medical practitioners debated the causes of mental distress. Was it bodily imbalance, spiritual weakness, environmental influence? Some treatments were surprisingly humane: music therapy, baths, dietary changes, companionship. Others were less gentle: restraints, isolation, more purging. Because if black bile was the problem, perhaps a strong laxative would solve existential dread. Probably not. Now, as we ease toward the softer edge of this part, consider something quietly important. Medieval people did not separate body and soul the way we often do. Mental illness was not purely psychological. It was cosmic, moral, physical, spiritual, which meant treatment could involve confession, herbs, astrology, and leeches, sometimes all in the same afternoon. And yet, beneath the wandering wombs and exorcisms, there were glimpses of understanding. They noticed patterns. They observed triggers. They sought explanations. They just lacked neuroscience. So tonight, as we drift further into this long, steady exploration of cures that sometimes cured, and often did not, remember that medieval medicine was a mirror. It reflected what people believed about the universe. And in that universe, the stars influenced your spleen, your womb traveled freely, and sadness could be drained like excess fluid. Let's begin with smallpox. Smallpox was ancient. It moved through Europe in waves, leaving survivors scarred and the unlucky buried. Symptoms began with fever and aches. Then came the rash. Then the pustules, hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. For those who survived, deep pockmarks remained. Facial scarring was common. Blindness could occur. And medieval medicine responded in the way it knew best. Balanced the humors. Bloodletting was used to reduce fever. Cooling diets were prescribed. Patients were kept in dim rooms. Herbal compresses were applied to soothe the skin. Some remedies were surprisingly gentle. Oatmeal baths, rosewater cloths. These did little to cure the virus, but they might reduce discomfort. Others were less helpful. There were ointments made of animal fat and plant ash. There were poultices involving pigeon droppings, because apparently, if you're covered in pustules, the logical next step is more organic material. The biggest issue wasn't cruelty, it was contagion. Smallpox spread easily, and medieval public health systems were emerging. Let's float toward quarantine. The concept of quarantine developed gradually. The word itself comes from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40. Ships arriving in Venice during plague outbreaks were required to wait 40 days before docking. 40 days felt spiritually appropriate, biblical, symbolic. Was 40 scientifically precise? Not exactly, but it was a start. For smallpox and other contagious illnesses, households were sometimes marked. Movement was restricted, not perfectly, but intentionally. Isolation wasn't new. It had already been practiced extensively with another disease, leprosy. Now we drift softly into one of medieval Europe's most misunderstood illnesses. Leprosy, now known as Hansen's disease, is a bacterial infection that affects skin and nerves. It progresses slowly, very slowly. In medieval Europe, it carried enormous stigma. Leprosy was often interpreted as divine punishment, or moral failure, or a sign of spiritual corruption. Leper houses, called leprosaria, were established outside city walls. Individuals diagnosed with leprosy were sometimes declared dead in symbolic ceremonies. They left their communities and lived separately. But here's the gentle twist. Many leprosaria were not horrific prisons. They were communities. Residents received food, shelter, and spiritual care. They could own property. Some even married within the community. It was segregation, yes, but it was also a form of structured care in a world that had limited tools. Diagnosis, however, was inconsistent. Skin conditions of many kinds were labeled as leprosy, psoriasis, vitiligo, other chronic illnesses. And once labeled, the social consequences were heavy. Treatment options were minimal. Herbal salves were used. Bloodletting again. Diet changes. Prayer. There was no antibiotic cure. because antibiotics were centuries away. So leprosy became not just a medical condition, but a social identity. Now let's gently pivot to something equally persistent: tuberculosis. Though not always clearly identified as we understand it today, consumption, as it was later called, haunted medieval populations. Chronic coughing, weight loss, pale skin, slow decline. There was a tragic poetry to it. The slow fading. Treatment focused on strengthening the body. Rich foods, milk, rest, fresh air, which, actually, is not entirely misguided. But without antibiotics, tuberculosis often won. Now let's drift into medieval ideas about immunity. People did notice patterns. If someone survived smallpox, they rarely got it again. This observation would eventually lead to inoculation practices centuries later. But in the medieval period, it remained an observation without a practical solution. And so prevention relied heavily on spiritual measures. Processions, prayer gatherings, relics of saints carried through cities. Because if disease was divine displeasure, divine negotiation seemed reasonable. Let's float briefly to hospitals again. Hospitals during outbreaks became crowded quickly. Resources were limited. Care was basic. But these institutions represented something important: collective response. Cities began recording deaths, tracking outbreaks, implementing rudimentary sanitation efforts. Garbage disposal improved in some regions. Water supplies were monitored, not because of germ theory, but because foul smells were associated with disease. And here's the quiet irony. While the reasoning was flawed, miasma rather than microbes, improving sanitation did sometimes reduce disease spread. Wrong theory, occasionally right outcome. Let's glide toward one more condition that shaped medieval society: ergotism. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye. When consumed, it can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and severe burning sensations in the limbs. Outbreaks of ergot poisoning were sometimes interpreted as divine punishment or witchcraft. Symptoms were dramatic. Limbs blackened from reduced blood flow. People experienced vivid visions. Treatment was limited. Removing contaminated grain from the diet was effective, if recognized. Some religious orders, like the Order of St. Anthony, specialized in caring for victims of St. Anthony's fire, as ergotism was called. Again, we see the same pattern: limited scientific understanding, but organized care. Now let's drift gently into the idea of plague doctors again. Not because we want more plague, but because they symbolize medieval public health. Plague doctors wore long robes coated in wax gloves, wide-brimmed hats, and the famous beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs. They carried canes to examine patients from a distance. It looks theatrical to us, almost costume-like, but it was an attempt at protection. The waxed robes may have offered minimal barrier protection, the distance maintained by the cane. Sensible, the herbs in the beak. Ineffective against bacteria, but psychologically reassuring. Public health was emerging, slowly, clumsily, but undeniably. Now let's soften the pace. Imagine living in a medieval town. You've seen smallpox take neighbors. You've heard the church bells toll for plague victims. You know someone in the leper house beyond the walls. Illness is not rare. It is woven into daily life. And yet, life continues. Markets open. Children play. Bread is baked. Weddings occur. Communities adapt. Which may be the most powerful medicine of all. As we close this part, notice something subtle. Medieval medicine often failed to cure, but medieval society did not collapse entirely under disease. It adjusted. It created quarantine. It built hospitals. It formed charitable networks. It made mistakes, many mistakes, but it also laid groundwork. We're talking about beauty. And in the medieval world, beauty was not separate from medicine. It was tangled up in it. Skin tone, complexion, hair, even smell, all were believed to reflect internal balance. If you looked healthy, your humors were behaving. If you looked pale and delicate, you were refined. If you looked sunburnt and sturdy, well, you were probably working in a field. Let's begin with pallor. Pale skin was fashionable among the medieval elite. It signaled wealth, nobility, indoor living, the gentle life of someone who did not harvest turnips. To achieve this luminous, almost translucent glow, people used powders and creams. And here's where things become quietly concerning. One common whitening agent was white lead. Yes, lead. Lead-based cosmetics created a smooth, bright finish. They covered blemishes beautifully. They also seeped into the skin and slowly poisoned the wearer. Symptoms of lead poisoning include headaches, abdominal pain, neurological issues, and eventually organ failure. But the complexion, radiant, and honestly, if everyone around you is doing it, and the alternative is looking like you've been outdoors, social pressure can be persuasive. Let's drift gently toward freckles and blemishes. Medieval medical theory linked skin conditions to internal imbalance. Too much heat in the blood might cause redness. Excess bile might lead to eruptions. So treatments targeted the humors. Cooling masks were applied. Vinegar washes. Pastes made from herbs and animal fats. Some recipes included crushed lilies. Others included sulfur. Sulfur, to be fair, does have antimicrobial properties. It smells terrible, but it works to some degree. Other treatments were more decorative than effective. Pigeon droppings reappear here, applied as facial masks. Because if your goal is elegance, why not begin with a bird? Now let's float toward hair. Hair was medically significant. Its thickness, texture, and color were believed to reflect humoral balance. Hair loss, especially in women, was distressing. Remedies included rubbing the scalp with onion juice, garlic paste, or even ground mice mixed with honey, which raises practical questions. Where does one acquire ground mice in bulk? And how committed are you to this hairstyle? Some treatments involved animal fat infused with herbs. Others recommended shaving the head entirely and applying restorative ointments. If nothing else, it kept the barber surgeon employed. Now we must gently address eyebrows. Thin, high foreheads were fashionable for women in parts of medieval Europe. So hairlines were adjusted. Women plucked or shaved the front of their hair to create the illusion of height. Eyebrows were thinned. It was a beauty standard rooted in the idea that a large forehead signified intelligence and nobility. No medical danger here, necessarily, just dedication. Let's drift toward teeth. We've already discussed extraction, but cosmetic dentistry, medieval style, also existed. To whiten teeth, people used abrasive powders made from crushed bones, oyster shells, or charcoal. These substances did remove surface stains. They also wore down enamel, which, in the long term, made teeth more sensitive and prone to decay. But at least for a while, your smile sparkled faintly in candlelight. Now let's gently glide towards scent. Medieval Europe did not lack bathing entirely, but regular daily showers were not the norm. Instead, scent management was key. Perfumes, pomanders, herbal sachets, all were used to maintain an aura of refinement. Strong body odor was associated with illness or moral failing, so fragrances served both social and medical functions. Rosewater was popular, lavender, musk. Occasionally, these perfumes masked underlying infections, but they did create an atmosphere. Now, let's move to something slightly darker. Mercury. Mercury reappears not just in disease treatment, but in cosmetic practices. It was used in skin creams to remove blemishes. It did lighten the skin. It also absorbed into the bloodstream. Chronic mercury exposure leads to tremors, mood changes, kidney damage, but the mirror showed smoother skin, which, in the medieval beauty hierarchy, might have seemed worth it. Let's softly pivot to weight. Body size was viewed through humoral theory. Thinness could indicate dryness or excess black bile. Plumpness might suggest moistness and abundance. For women, especially, being moderately full-figured was often desirable. It suggested fertility and wealth, but sudden weight changes were concerning. Physicians might prescribe diet adjustments, more warming foods, fewer cold foods to rebalance the system. And here's the quiet thread running through all of this. Beauty was medical. Medical was moral. Moral was spiritual. Everything intertwined. Now let's gently approach something peculiar. Blood as skincare. In some traditions, applying fresh animal blood to the face was believed to restore vitality. The logic was simple. Blood equals life. Therefore, blood equals rejuvenation. It did not work. But symbolism is powerful. There were also bath treatments involving milk. Milk baths were believed to soften and brighten skin. And actually, milk contains lactic acid, which gently exfoliates. So occasionally, amid the lead and mercury, a sensible idea slipped through. Let's float briefly to the men. Medieval men were not immune to beauty anxieties. Beards were significant. A thick beard signaled masculinity and status. If beard growth was patchy, remedies included rubbing the face with oils infused with herbs, or more dramatically, animal dung. Because clearly, if you want hair to grow, you start with fertilizer. Some of these oils may have stimulated circulation slightly. Most did little, but grooming rituals mattered socially. Now let's wander toward something both medical and cosmetic, bloodletting for complexion. It was believed that removing excess blood could improve skin clarity. A lighter, cooler appearance followed blood loss. Of course, excessive bloodletting could also cause weakness and fainting. But fainting delicately was sometimes fashionable. Now, imagine being a noblewoman in a stone castle. You wake up. You consult your mirror, which is polished metal, slightly distorted. You apply a lead-based cream. You dab rosewater on your cheeks. You pluck your hairline. You sip a tonic containing crushed pearl. And somewhere nearby, an apothecary grinds something that used to crawl. All in the name of harmony. As we soften toward the end of this part, remember that beauty standards have always carried risk. Today, we inject, laser, and resurface. Then, they applied heavy metals and hoped for balance. Different tools, same impulse. The desire to look healthy, youthful, blessed by good humors. And in a world where disease was visible and constant, appearing robust or delicately noble was a kind of armor. Let's begin with lead. Medieval Europe adored lead. It was soft, easy to shape, resistant to corrosion, and wonderfully cooperative. So naturally, it ended up everywhere. Water pipes, cooking vessels, storage containers, cosmetics, even wine sweetener. Yes, wine. In some regions, lead compounds were added to sour wine to improve the taste. It worked. It also caused chronic lead poisoning. Symptoms included abdominal pain, confusion, irritability, infertility, and eventually organ damage. But since these symptoms developed slowly, over time, they were rarely traced back to the charming goblet or the stylish white face powder. Instead, people simply seemed unwell, moody, frail, perhaps humoral imbalance, of course, definitely not the cup. And while we're in the kitchen, let's gently glance at cookware. Pewter plates and cups often contained lead. Food stored in glazed pottery could absorb toxic elements if the glaze was improperly fired. Acidic foods, like stews with vinegar, were particularly efficient at pulling metals into dinner, so your comforting cabbage soup may have come with a trace mineral bonus. Not the good kind. Over time, this constant low-level exposure built up. But medieval medicine did not have the concept of cumulative toxicity. If you became sluggish or ill, perhaps you needed bloodletting. Again, because why not double down? Now let's drift toward walls. Medieval homes, especially later in the period, sometimes featured pigments made with arsenic or other heavy metals. Bright greens were particularly suspicious. Arsenic-based pigments were vibrant and fashionable. They also released toxic particles over time, especially in damp environments. So if you were wealthy enough to afford decorative interiors, congratulations. Your wallpaper might be plotting softly against your lungs. But symptoms like coughing, fatigue, or strange skin issues would be blamed on miasma, or bile, or planetary misalignment. The walls remained innocent. Speaking of air, indoor smoke was a constant companion. Open hearths burned wood, peat, or coal. Ventilation was optimistic. Chimneys existed, but smoke often lingered. Chronic exposure to smoke led to respiratory issues, irritated eyes, persistent coughs, lung damage, but fire was essential. It heated the home, cooked the food, dried the clothes. You couldn't exactly file a complaint with medieval building control, so people inhaled quietly and carried on. The concept of air quality simply wasn't there. If you coughed, perhaps you needed a tonic, something herbal, maybe with a little mercury. Now let's gently move to bread. Bread was life in medieval Europe, but grain storage was tricky. If rye became contaminated with ergot fungus, entire communities could suffer. We touched on ergotism before, the convulsions, the burning limbs, the hallucinations. But here, the quiet domestic tragedy. Sometimes families were poisoning themselves, slowly, with their daily loaf. They didn't know. The bread looked normal enough. Maybe slightly dark. Maybe a little bitter. And then symptoms appeared. Limbs tingled. Minds wandered. Fires were blamed on demons, because fungus is far less dramatic than possession. Water sources, too, carried risks. Wells could be contaminated by nearby waste. Rivers doubled as drinking water and sewage disposal. Without germ theory, contamination was invisible. Clear water looked safe. It tasted fine. It also sometimes carried dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and other delightful microbial passengers. People didn't associate the water with disease directly. They associated foul smells with disease. So if the water didn't smell terrible, it must be fine. And if illness followed, back to the humours we go. Let's not forget alcohol. Medieval ale was often safer than water because the brewing process killed some pathogens. So people drank beer daily, including children. Light ale, of course. But here's the twist. Storage barrels could leach substances, and excessive alcohol consumption brought its own health consequences. Liver damage existed long before anyone could name it, but it was simply part of life. A man who drank heavily and declined physically might be described as melancholic, or morally weak. The liver remained politely undiscussed. Now drift with me to textiles. Dyes used in clothing sometimes contained toxic substances. Tanners worked with chemicals that damaged skin and lungs. Hat makers used mercury in felt production. Yes, mad as a hatter has historical roots. Chronic mercury exposure caused tremors, mood swings, cognitive decline. But again, the connection wasn't obvious. A hat maker behaving erratically was simply eccentric. Occupational hazard was not yet a recognized concept. It was just fate, or temperament. And then there were candles. Tallow candles released soot and fumes indoors. Beeswax was cleaner but expensive, so most households accepted a steady haze. Combine that with hearth smoke, limited ventilation, and perhaps a little arsenic pigment, and your cozy medieval evening becomes a slow, atmospheric experiment. No dramatic collapse, just gradual wear on the lungs. Even gardens had their quiet risks. Some medicinal herbs were mildly toxic. Foxglove, for instance, contains digitalis. In controlled amounts, it can affect heart function beneficially. In uncontrolled amounts, which describes most medieval dosage methods, it can cause heart rhythm disturbances. But the plant looked beautiful, and beauty, as we've seen, often doubled as medicine or poison. Sometimes both. The truly unsettling part of all this is how ordinary it was. No dramatic villain stirring arsenic into stew. No sinister apothecary plotting doom. Just daily life. Cooking, decorating, brewing, dyeing, heating. All gently layering exposure upon exposure. And when illness emerged, slowly, fatigue, confusion, chronic pain, there was no environmental checklist to consult. There was only imbalance, bile, blood, perhaps an ill-timed full moon. Yet, medieval people were resilient. They adapted without knowing exactly what they were adapting to. Some practices unintentionally reduced risk. Boiling water for certain recipes, brewing ale, improving chimney design over time. Regulations slowly emerging in cities about waste disposal. Progress was incremental, quiet, often accidental. Let's begin with the royal touch. For centuries in England and France, it was believed that monarchs possessed a divine ability to cure a disease called scrofula, a form of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes, especially in the neck. Scrofula caused swollen glands, visible lumps, chronic discomfort, and apparently the cure was a handshake. The royal touch ceremony involved the king or queen physically touching the afflicted person, sometimes accompanied by prayer. A coin, called an angel, might be given afterward as a token. And here's the remarkable part. Thousands of people lined up for this. Kings like Edward the Confessor were credited with healing powers. Later, monarchs continued the tradition. Even into the early modern period, rulers like Charles II of England performed these ceremonies regularly. Did it cure tuberculosis? No, but scrofula can sometimes go into remission naturally, and if improvement followed a royal encounter, well, divine confirmation achieved. The monarchy benefited politically. Healing reinforced legitimacy. Divine right became tangible, and patience. They received attention, ritual, recognition. Sometimes belief is a powerful bomb. Now let's gently drift toward relics. Medieval Europe was filled with relics. Bones of saints, fragments of clothing, vials of holy oil. These were not decorative items. They were medical resources. If you were ill, you might travel on pilgrimage to a shrine. You might touch a reliquary. You might press a cloth to a saint's tomb, and then apply that cloth to your wound. Entire economies grew around pilgrimage sites. Take the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury. Pilgrims traveled long distances, seeking healing. Crutches were left behind as proof of miracles. Now, from a modern perspective, we may raise an eyebrow. But remember, stress affects illness. Hope affects recovery. Social support affects survival. Pilgrimage provided all three. Fresh air, community, a break from routine. And if you returned home feeling stronger, the saint received the credit. Let's float toward charms and amulets. Medical charms were often inscribed with prayers or symbols. They were sewn into clothing, worn around the neck, or placed under pillows. Some included specific biblical verses. Others invoked particular saints associated with certain ailments. Saint Apollonia was invoked for toothaches. Saint Blaise for throat problems. It was a spiritual pharmacy. And again, we see the same thread. Medicine was not isolated from faith. It was intertwined. Now, let's gently approach astrology one final time. Physicians consulted star charts before treatments. Certain days were favorable for bloodletting. Others were not. The zodiac governed body parts. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Leo the heart. If the moon was in the wrong position, surgery might be postponed. From our perspective, this feels decorative, but medieval people genuinely believed the cosmos influenced the body. And in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. The sun affects circadian rhythms. Seasonal changes affect mood. They just expanded that influence. Enthusiastically, now let's drift to one of the gentlest cures of all. Prayer itself. Prayer was prescribed. Confession was recommended. Spiritual peace was considered part of physical healing. And here's something quietly important. Reducing stress does help the body. A calm mind can support recovery. So while prayer did not eliminate bacteria, it may have steadied hearts. Now, as we bring this long topic to a soft close, let's reflect. Medieval medicine often harmed unintentionally. Bloodletting weakened the sick. Mercury poisoned the hopeful. Lead sweetened wine while stealing vitality. Boiling oil punished the wounded. But woven through all of it was something deeply human. People wanted to help. Physicians studied ancient texts for answers. Barber surgeons honed their blades with determination. Apothecaries carefully measured herbs and ground mysterious powders. Kings extended their hands in ritual healing. They were not ignorant caricatures. They were navigating a world without microscopes, without germ theory, without antibiotics, without anesthesia. And within those limits, they experimented. Sometimes disastrously, sometimes accidentally, effectively. Honey on wounds, quarantine during outbreaks, improved sanitation over time. Progress did not arrive in a triumphant parade. It crept, quietly, like most meaningful change. So as you lie there, warm and very much not covered in leeches, consider how far medicine has traveled, from wandering wombs to neurology, from miasma to microbiology, from unicorn horn to clinical trials. And yet the impulse remains the same. When someone suffers, we try something. We mix herbs. We write prescriptions. We search the stars. We build laboratories. We hope. And sometimes that hope is the thread connecting centuries. Thank you for drifting through this long, softly hazardous chapter of history. Close your eyes. No barber surgeons nearby. No arsenic wallpaper. No royal handshake required. Just quiet. And the comforting knowledge that if you wake up tomorrow with a headache, no one is reaching for a leech. Sleep well.